Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the introduction. And I will, in such a wonderful opportunity as this one, I will be somewhat kind of impolite to recall controversial or even tragic moments that relates my country to the international organization. However, if we want to avoid repeating history, then we should face failures and misfortunes as well. Hungary wanted to join soon the United Nations, soon after it was established. Yet these nations actually were united against us, Hungary being on the wrong side of history again. Maybe this one? I'm sorry, I'm not sure if I can move that. Thank you.
It's good to know what the receiver.
That's Hungary's misfortune I'm representing now. Thank you. So we were on the wrong side.
Okay, now it's working. You can press again.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. So we were, Hungary being on the wrong side as part of the Axis powers. By now, it seems a kind of Hungaricum to side with the troublemakers and the losers and then complain about our centuries-long ill fate. In spite of Hungary losing the war and then again losing the peace as well, the United Nations reached out its hand to my war-torn country and assisted in rebuilding it. That Prime Minister Ferenc Nagy logically assumed that the assistance will help in creating democracy and incorporation the United Nations Charter's principles into the Hungarian legal system. Yet, geopolitics overrode expectations, and the Iron Curtain soon excluded also our hopes to join the community of free nations. Hungary had to wait 10 years to join, according to the Cold War dynamics. Appeals were introduced and rejected following the ideology of the sharpening class struggle that only ended with the death of Stalin. Yet Stalinism survived, not the last in the United Nations itself, where the Soviet representative was Andrei Vyshinsky, the chief prosecutor of Stalinist true trials. So this is the building of the United Nations. And to be frank, the United States position was also controversial that time. The FBI had an office inside the United Nations building, and American employees became targets of the McCarthy's witch hunt that took the life of the legal genius Abraham Feller, one of the architects of the UN Charter. The wonderful moment of Hungary's accession to the United Nations was the result of a long process. However, strangely enough, not initiated by the Foreign Ministry, but the Communist Secret Services. In Washington, D.C., the communist agents were easily controlled by the American Secret Services. However, in New York, chances were much better to infiltrate foreign services, international organizations, and then spread disinformation, start subversive activity, and even plan and commit covert actions. Documents prove that each step taken for the Hungarian UN membership was not only controlled, but designed and executed by the AVH, Államvédelmi Hatóság, the Hungarian Secret Services, under diplomatic cover. This was true for the negotiations with the UN, for the logistics of establishing the mission, and for the final moment of the accession on December 14, 1955, when the Hungarian membership was voted by the members of the General Assembly. Here I have to correct myself. The magic moment when finally Hungary became a member of the family of nations was preceded by a long bargaining on the spot, behind the scenes compromises, going into the late night, and the Hungarian secret agent present, Pál Rácz, with the code name János Arany in the Academy of Sciences. He was the chief general secretary of the Academy of Sciences, a wonderful romantic poet of the 19th century, got fed up and left the building. In the crucial moment, not even one Hungarian was present in the assembly hall. Even the sleepy secret police agent was missing. The cynical pragmatism of the communist secret services soon had its historical consequences. No one expected that the new kid in the block will soon become the protagonist in the United Nations when, on October 23, 1956, the revolution broke out and Soviet tanks rolled in to suppress it. The United Nations Security Council soon included the events in its agenda. However, the Hungarian representative, Péter Kós, you can see him on with a hat, flying with a Malay airplane to New York, declared it a domestic matter in which the United Nations has no authority to be involved. The uproar that followed the statement was understandable both in New York and in Budapest, and concluded in the recall of Kós. Only few people knew, and no one actually said then that if the Hungarian representative followed the instructions of the revolutionary government, that time in the hope of a compromise with Moscow. The Soviet leadership set the condition of withdrawing the Hungarian issue from the UN agenda to start negotiations. Kós was replaced by the second in command at the Hungarian UN mission, János Szabó, authorized by a cable from Imre Nagy. You can see him sitting in the front row. At the very same time, the Suez crisis developed in close to a war situation in the Middle East, and Moscow, responding to the Israeli-French-British attack on Egypt, decided against the peaceful solution in Hungary, preparing for a general war in connection with Suez. Imre Nagy soon realized that instead of Soviet armed forces leaving the country, tanks are pouring in. So November 1st, that's Imre Nagy, he turned to the United Nations Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld, declaring Hungary's neutrality and withdrawing from the Warsaw Pact, the present for the Soviet intervention in Hungary. His cables to the United Nations were received by János Szabó, who was also an agent, with the codename Bertalan Székely, a wonderful painter, a bit like Károly Lotz style. The loyal diplomat, in quotation mark, however, followed the instruction of his handlers, Imre Hollai and Pál Rácz. Imre Hollai was also an AVH captain, and later he became the president of the General Secretary of the General Assembly of the United Nations. Still, his portraits are there in the hall. So his handlers, Imre Hollai and Pál Rácz, and not of his boss, Imre Nagy, who acted that time also as a Minister of Foreign Affairs. Szabó's strategy of sabotage included concerns with his accreditation, problems with the interpretation of the cable from Imre Nagy, the lack of information from Hungary, and when he took the floor at the Security Council meeting, he mentioned only that Soviet and Hungarian negotiations were underway. These negotiations happened actually at the Soviet base in Tököl, where KGB General Ivan Serov arrested Pál Maléter, Minister of Defense, and his delegation, who came to discuss details of the Soviet withdrawal from Hungary. The invasion of the Soviet army on November 4th and the cruel pacification of Hungary clearly contradicted to the United Nations Charter, and at the same time demonstrated the United Nations' incapacity to deal with international conflicts when a great power is involved. First, the Soviet veto at the Security Council paralyzed the system, then the General Assembly took over to find a solution to the conflict. Meanwhile, Hammarskjöld had to deal with the two crises simultaneously, and the Soviet support to his efforts in Suez was crucial. The solution of the Hungarian problem, as the United Nations terminology referred to the bloodshed, destruction, and 200,000 Hungarians leaving the country, was postponed and again postponed. That time, the relationship between the Western powers cooled down due to the conflict in the Middle East, and trust was undermined. Now we also know that the information provided to the Secretary General about the Hungarian situation was inspired by the Soviets. Practically, he was misguided, while the Hungarian delegation insisted on Imre Nagy's previous declaration about the Hungarian problem being a domestic matter. When the only politician on free soil, Minister of the Revolutionary Cabinet, Anna Anna Kately, who rushed to New York to talk to the representatives of member states, she was rejected, not having a valid mandate by the United Nations administrative standards. At the same time, hardly anyone knew that the UN provided an enormous amount of humanitarian aid to the Hungarian people under the aegis of the Red Cross and distributed by the charity organization, as the United Nations soon became an enemy power for the Soviet-installed Hungarian government. Also, a great amount of support was provided to the Hungarian refugees, the largest movement of population after World War II, masterfully managed by the United Nations High Commissioner of Refugees and other organizations. The political solution failed 11 times after Hammarskjöld made one attempt after the other to respond to the crisis. Finally, a special committee was formed in January 1957 to investigate and report about the revolution to the General Assembly, yet writing history is not the same as making history, so by the pure act, for it was a sign of powerlessness, the previous condemnation of the Soviet invasion did not change anything. It was unlikely another one will, after the report will be introduced. Meanwhile, the terror only grew stronger in Hungary. As a symbolic act, the Hungarian mandate at the United Nations was suspended. However, the neo-Stalinist agents and diplomats could use and misuse the infrastructure and even the pulpit of the assembly hall of the organization. The report of the special committee was a great anamnesis of the Hungarian problem, but there was no diagnosis and definitely no cure for 33 years. And hardly by chance, when creating and presenting the report, many controversial facts referred to the weaknesses of the United Nations. Paul Bang-Jensen, the Danish international civil servant working for the committee, found it more than strange that in many cases mistakes remained in the report, and in spite of his suggestions to correct those, when he is this incorrecting, he was suspended from his work, and that no security considerations protected the Hungarian witnesses who shared the experiences with the committee, as it was not allowed to enter Hungary, so refugees were witnessing. That the Secretary General was also misguided in more than once. We know by now that it was intentional that the deadline for presenting the report was constantly modified, and it was published just before the summer vacations, that no emergency sessions were called to discuss it during the summer, and nearly a year passed from the events to include it in the agenda of the United Nations. The sabotage of solving the Hungarian problem in the spirit of the Charter initiated very high, probably on the 38th floor of the United Nations, where the Secretary General and his assistance offices are. The information that Bang-Jensen received from Eastern Bloc diplomats who were shocked by the suppression of the Hungarian Revolution and planned to defect was that the highest level of the United Nations is influenced by Moscow. It is hardly surprising that when the Danish civil servant, Bang-Jensen, was later instructed to turn over the list of the Hungarian witnesses who were afraid of reprisals concerning themselves or their families and gave their testimony anonymously, he had all the reasons to reject it to his bosses at the United Nations. Disobedience and several other accusations followed Bang-Jensen's moral stand that concluded in firing him from the United Nations by unfounded charges that included also character assassination. When he did not give up his fight and wanted to prove his position, he disappeared from his home at Thanksgiving 1959, and his wife and 5 children did not see him alive anymore. He was found dead in a few days, and still today we do not know that he committed suicide or was killed. Let me recall finally his memory, who believed more in the principles of the United Nations was built upon than many working for or even representing the organization. Lesson to learn for all of us. Thank you.